There's so many, and the estate agent will love you because you're a first-time buyer.
Okay, James, I've got a message saying we're now live on YouTube. James, can you hear me? I've got a message saying we're now live on YouTube.
Yeah, so have I, Chair. So, yeah, I think we're okay to start. I think what would be helpful, what would be helpful also if anyone not speaking mutes their microphone. So
Okay. We'll make a start then. Welcome to Northamptonshire County Council's Overview and Scrutiny meeting. Taking on board James's comment about anybody perhaps not speaking, using your microphone until you do speak. Hopefully that will help with some of the sound issues. Welcome.
You echo. You echo completely. It's very awful.
I don't know the answer. I think we're just going to have to plough ahead. Well, welcome to this meeting. This is the first time, obviously, we've met in a couple of months, but I think it's really important, despite the current emergency, that we do meet. Our remit clearly is at the County Council's finances, which is still an issue, and probably more so with the current emergency, which is a substantive part of what we're talking about today.
We can barely understand what you say.
I don't know what to suggest. Is everybody having difficulties hearing?
Yeah.
I think
it's a loud echo, Nick, about 3 times over.
Yeah, I think James needs to mute in the room as well. That should help.
It's the mic in the room, James. If you, it'll stop the echo.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. That's better, but perhaps.
That's it. Yeah.
Okay. Right. In that case, without any further ado, if we turn to today's agenda. First of all, do we have any apologies for non-attendance? I'm not aware of any. James, have you had any? Or anybody?
sorry.
I mean, whether this picture will come up or not, I don't know. But
we Council Walters to mute
Monica got muted.
Okay, this is. I'm having difficulties myself hearing people. James, apologies for non-attendance.
We have no apologies for non-attendance.
Okay. In that case, then I should.
It's awful. We have now echo after echo after echo. We cannot have a meeting like that.
As Anna said, muted, it helps.
I think everybody is muted that I can see, still causing problems.
Chair, to be honest, the one difference between this meeting and the 2 cabinet meetings, for example, is that I'm running this through the NCC system, whereas the cabinet meetings have been through a live broadband, just a plain broadband connection. I don't know whether that is making a difference.
Okay, so that raises the question: how difficult would it be to change to the other system?
It might be possible from 10:30 when the room that the cabinet normally uses, which wasn't available today, is due. It may be available.
Okay, I'm inclined.
Information, Nick. James is on my with no echo. It's on yours that we've got an echo. James is loud and clear.
I've got an account and I can just send out an invitation.
That's clear as well, that one.
So sorry, you're saying it's me?
It's Labour.
It's James, I think, because if he mutes his, then I think it's better.
Okay, so if we mute James, we may be okay. All right, James, stay muted. Right, in that case, item 2 on the agenda is notifications of requests of members of the public to address the meeting. I have none, and I presume that hasn't changed since I was informed there were none. So item 3 then is declarations of members' interests. If anybody needs to speak, by the way, I mean, obviously this is going to be a bit difficult seeing everybody on the screen like this. Please hold your hand up as clearly as you can to the camera, and I'll try and pick up anybody that wants to speak. Any declarations of interests? Okay, I don't see any. So just Chairman's announcements is really just to introduce you then to this first remote meeting and ask for your patience as we try to get through some of the technical difficulties in this sort of new way of working. I would also, however, like to advise the committee formally. I think everybody knows Councillor Wendy Brackenbury has left the committee. Now she's been appointed to the Council's cabinet. I'd like to thank her for her contributions and the work that she's been involved with Scrutiny over the last year or so. As yet, I understand we're waiting to know who will replace her. No doubt we'll hear that in due course. Item 5, minutes of the overview and scrutiny meeting held on the 26th of February. You should have all the documentation in front of you. We need to approve that as a true record. Before we do, I'd just like to say this was the meeting where we discussed the setting up of the Children's Trust. I mean, obviously there have been some big changes since then with the advent of the pandemic, and certainly the timescales are not as clear as we hoped they were at that time. I would like to say, though, that the minutes that we're about to approve, I think, are a really good record and a real use to both members of the council and perhaps members of the public who want to know how the trust is being set up. I mean, clearly the trust isn't a decision for this council. It's being dictated to us, if you like, by government, and the Children's Commissioner is actively involved in that. But I think anybody that wants to know more about the Children's Trust could do no worse than to take some time to read through the minutes of this meeting. I think they're quite informative. That said, can we approve that these are a fair and accurate record of that meeting? I'm seeing Councillor Birch.
Agreed.
Oh, sorry, you were agreeing.
Yes, I was agreeing.
Yeah, apologies. I thought you were wanted to speak. Okay, I saw nods. So unless anybody shouts up, we'll approve those minutes. I won't be physically signing them because I don't have them in front of me, but presumably the new way of working allows for that. That then brings us to the main part of today's meeting, the substantial issue, which is the financial implications of COVID-19. This is on the back of a cabinet report that went to the council's cabinet a couple of weeks ago, explaining some of the extra expenditure that the council are anticipating, and also explaining that there will, at the moment, it looks as though there will be a shortfall between what emergency funding we've received from government and that expenditure. I appreciate what we're going to discuss today is important. but it is still going to be very difficult to get an exact handle on where it's going to leave the council, both for this financial year and indeed moving forward for the future, and there will be implications for unitaries as well. Without any further ado, I mean, hopefully you've all had a chance to read through some of the supporting evidence we've had, which hopefully offers a bit more detail than was in the Cabinet report. I'd like to ask the Section 5.1 officer, the Council's Finance Director, Mr. Scarr, if he could maybe just give us a brief overview, and then we need to throw this open for members to sort of ask any questions or raise any concerns. The outcome of this meeting, hopefully, of course, will be for us to offer any commentary, suggestions, advice even to the council's leadership. And to that end, I'd like to thank the council's leader, Councillor Matt Golby, who's here with us in the room today. I mean, obviously he'll see any formal response we have, but I think it's important to get the mood of the meeting and any nuances from the discussion. So I'm really pleased that you're here with us today. Sorry, Barry Scott.
Thank you, Chair.
Sorry, we can't hear you. Is there? You are unmuted. No, I'm getting nothing. I presume nobody can hear. Great.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, try again.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes? Okay then, all right. So I say from the start of COVID-19, the wider impact is well understood, but it was clear that financial pressures were building up in the council immediately as the pandemic hit, and especially when lockdown was facilitated by the government. These are very early days in trying to estimate what has never been estimated before, the effect of essentially a national crisis on the council's finances. So it's manifested itself in several areas, and you will see from the analysis that cost pressure, certainly in terms of care services and or waste collection services, well, waste disposal services have built up. But we're trying to put a number on that, and again, the working papers are there if you want to ask any questions. It was also clear that loss of income was a key factor on two strands: loss of operational income for the council, which would have an immediate impact on libraries, car parking, and all of those other services, but also long-term loss of council tax and business rates as well, which would take longer to manifest, as that would bring its way through the collection fund, not through the council's day-to-day income. And again, whilst we put a figure in for that's a bit of a longer-term cost. What is less clear is some of the money that we're being asked to spend on underwriting the market. This is in line with Cabinet Office and government guidance on keeping fragile markets ticking over, and I'm thinking in particular the stuff that we've been asked to do on adult social care and on stuff like bus routes and our main contractors as well, where we're heeding Cabinet Office guidance. We're paying money to contractors sometimes for services that aren't being received, but again, this is to keep that market stable. What's not clear from government guidance is that a payment that will be there ad infinitum, or will there be some kind of reconciliation at the end and some kind of recovery if, for example, there's been double payment of grant in terms of business support, furlough grants, and continual payments by the council. So whilst we continue to go down that route, I think later on there'll be some kind of reconciliation as to how that will all pan out in the future. And again, we've tried to capture that within the Cabinet report. Once again, to emphasise that this is an initial estimate. We've done it in period 1 of the financial year. MHCLG have committed to monthly data returns. We will be filling in these returns and working closely with colleagues at county council level, facilitated by Grant Thornton, to make sure that we all take a standardised approach to filling that in as well. And I think the returns have been sent out. You will see that also that the government have changed returns from April to May. So whilst we're filling the returns, in comparison between the two returns is difficult because they're both entirely different from one month to the next. So just bear that in mind if you're going to ask questions about comparisons between the May return and the April return, because they're two very different returns. I think I've mentioned in the Cabinet report that We're not in Section 114 territory as yet. We're not in any kind of cash flow crisis. We've got plenty of cash to see us through. I keep an eye on the cash flow on a weekly basis. That's not an issue. And we're still seeing almost weekly announcements on additional funding from government. I'm seeing the announcement for to pass through the care homes for sterilisation, and some of the recovery funding. There's a 50 million high streets funding stream being announced as well by the government to help aid the recovery when shops open. So whilst until we've reached the end of that process and we've gotten the final settlement from government, I don't think we're anywhere near a Section 114 position as yet. But obviously that's under a constant monitoring and review. As we move forward into the regular committee cycle, I'll be presenting the monthly monitoring reports and identifying what the business as usual budget is, i.e. the non-COVID related budget and how that would be panning out. And then added on top of that will be separately identified the COVID pressure, so we can monitor the county council's core budget and what the impact of COVID means going forward. I think I'll stop at that point, Chair. I don't know if you want to bring Councillor Longley in for to give an overview from the cabinet member.
Yeah, by all means, Malcolm, you're the portfolio holder from the cabinet responsible for finance. Is there anything you wish to add before we open it up to discussion?
Yeah, sure, Mick. Mick, you could do with muting yourself, I think.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, I mean, Barry's got it pretty good. You've got to get the backdrop to this, as I'm sure you'll fully appreciate. There we were. We just wrapped up last year's nicely successful year, all in the bag, and all feeling very satisfied with ourselves. Then, out of the blue, of course, immediately comes this very, very unexpected experience. Now, Barry and his team made a first shot of it, and I sort of wrote a note that went round, and that initially showed a 57 million hit, of which we got 35 million from the government. We've now, Barry's now sort of refined that somewhat, and we think it's looking near 48, but it's a moving feast. And I think that's the very important point here, is that it could go up, could go down. And just every month, Barry and his team try and get a handle on this. We've got 35 million we know of from government. So the key question becomes, if you take 48 and take 35 away, well, everybody can do the number. Now, what, if anything, when the final reconciliation takes place, will the government do or not do? And that's a question we just don't know. So we're sort of going to go through, I reckon, for some considerable time. And I think probably this sort of meeting is probably best held probably every couple of months, something like that, because I suspect in 2 months' time, when we sit down again, we might have a changed set of numbers, albeit not dramatically, hopefully. So I think that really sets the scene. You know, we're doing extremely well. We're 2 years in the bag. 3 years we were expecting a bit of a coast this year, frankly, but that doesn't seem it's going to be that way. So we are where we are. But anyway, that's the backdrop to it, Nick. So okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Malcolm. I had a couple of questions, and I think maybe you actually perhaps half answered one of them. The returns that we've all been that have been circulated to us that went into government are dated the middle of April, and I was going to ask if they are still the most up to date. So I think from a friend who works for another authority, not in Northamptonshire, that the government asked for further returns last week or the week before. So I was going to ask if those figures were correct. Now, those figures that we've got are obviously linked to the cabinet report, and as you say, we're showing a potential emergency spend this financial year of 57 million, but you're now saying perhaps that, and I appreciate everything is guesswork, but that may be 48 million now. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, for the detail, I'll best refer back to Barry there, because he put the numbers together, but that's my understanding of it, Nick. Yeah.
That's correct. Yeah.
Sorry. Okay. I mean, basically, we're in the same position that every council up and down the country, of course, is in. We're all spending money. The government have given us some money, and there is potentially a shortfall between those two figures. I do have one question, again, referring to the report that went into government, we spoke about reserves, because a lot of councils undoubtedly will be trying to utilise their reserves, at least for this financial year. Now, we've made a comment to government because of our sort of financial difficulties in the past. The level of reserves are currently at the statutory minimum. That implies, I think, that we can't use any reserves, in which case any shortfall will give us a I don't know what I'm doing. Can you hear me? Oh, you can. Excellent.
Yeah, we can now.
Did you hear my diatribe? I was okay. Very quickly then, one question I had. Clearly there will be a shortfall for every council up and down the country. Most councils, I think, in this financial year will be able to access reserves. We've made the point, however, in our commentary to government, that our level of reserves are currently at the statutory minimum, sort of implying that we won't be able to use any reserves. And my question about that is statutory minimum. I mean, I think we've got 40 odd million pound of reserves at the moment. I've always understood it in the past that there wasn't a sort of national statutory minimum of sort of proportion depending on the size of the council, that it was actually the section 151 officer's job to make a decision on what an individual council's reserve should be. And in the past, we've always talked about it being 120, 140 million, a long way off the 40 million that we have at the moment. Can I just get clarification on this statutory minimum phrase, and that we will not be able to use any reserves, which seems to be the implication?
So I come in the principle thing, Barry, first, and then perhaps you come in the detail is. I mean, the reality is, Mick, is that quite clearly these reserves have been hard come by, and it would be a poor thing for us to have to use them if we had to. Ideally, would not wish to do so. We still, as I said a little bit earlier on, are in the position we don't know the final position of the government. So until we know that, then really it's a bit academic, you know. You can sort of, but our initial position would be one of not wishing to use those reserves if we most possibly could avoid doing so, obviously. Barry, do you want to comment on the technicalities of
that? Can you hear me? Yeah. I think whether it's statutory or not, and it's a moot point whether it's statutory, it's my assessment under the Local Government Finance Act that reserves are at a minimal level. And it's been a point of discussion amongst colleagues at various councils, because technically if reserves are earmarked, then they're earmarked and can't be used for anything else. My judgment is that because of the council's fragile financial position, as reported by various external bodies, that we are not in a position to use reserves to cover us in the long term for to fund this particular spending pressure.
Okay, just one last point on that then. If the small amounts of reserves we have are earmarked, and if they cannot be used for any shortfall for emergency COVID, then we are going to have a problem. So I'm just interested why that wouldn't automatically, not necessarily push us over the edge, but certainly push us towards section 114 territory. Because if we don't have the money to make the shortfall, then there must, you know, there will be a gap unless government step in.
That is correct, Chair. But at the moment, the advice that we're getting from MHCLG and CIPFA is to not at the moment issue section 114 recommendations. The government funding cycle hasn't finished. We're still lobbying government. Again, my judgment is until at least the autumn now, we have enough money to balance the budget, and I think it would be premature until the government has definitely said that no further money is available 100% to even start talking about section 114, because as I said before, we are seeing additional funding streams coming through.
Okay, let me throw it open to anybody else before I do.
Nick, if I may. Yeah, I mean, what Barry says, you've got to bear, there's two factors here that you have to bear in mind that makes this a premature decision. The first thing is we're only here now in the end of period 2. You know, there's a long way to go this year yet, and that's the first thing. The second thing I said earlier on several times is that we need to know where the government stands on this, and they won't tell us that until they've got a clearer picture themselves. So we're sort of down the track there in any event. So I reckon that we'll begin to have a far better idea of where we stand at the half year. I think that coincides with Barry's view. It's and at the half year, I think we can then start to be much clearer on the year end. But before that, I think we're all a bit, you know, sort of seeing which way the wind's blowing, and we know what the principles are, but the practical is yet to unfold before us.
Indeed, and I appreciate that. Everything at the moment is guesswork, and whilst we're talking about this financial year, also we've got to consider the ongoing implications, loss of income, extra demand for services, any impacts of any economic downturn. It's really difficult to comment. Can I throw it open? However,
just one point there worth bringing in here, Mick. Barry might want to comment on this, in that the implications of this are not only in this financial year. And Barry, you were talking about rolling into the new financial year, and perhaps you might want to enlighten everybody in that regard.
It's in the area of council tax and business rates, especially where this is the impact. So although we're seeing potential loss of collection on both of those income streams, that will not be accounted for until the 21-22 budget because of the way that the collection fund works. And so the deficit will build up this year, but will have to be accounted for in next year's budget. And that is the major impact that will cross financial years. And also, obviously, if there are spending pressures that build up in, say, for example, care packages, those packages will roll over into the next financial year as well, and we'll have to make budget provision for that in the 2 new unitary councils.
Indeed, and I think Malcolm was right. We're going to have to revisit this again and again and again throughout the year and try and get a handle of how it's going to move forward. And at some stage, actually, there may need to be some sort of joint working with all the districts and boroughs, because whilst we have NCC's figures here, obviously they also are going to have their own problems, and of course we need to be half looking towards unitary, so we need at some stage to get a real picture. Probably a job for the shadow authority, but right, I've got Cecile, you wanted to speak, and then Michael.
Yes, thank you so much, Mick. You know, I think we can discuss for a very long term, but at the moment it would be better, because Barry and Malcolm have put what they know at the moment, and what they are telling us is it's a good start, but we don't know yet to the extent. So I do think, because it's all on video and so on, I think we have enough information that in the future we can ask questions. But at the moment, the movie's feast, and we are informed as much as they know, and we should don't have too much of a long meeting, because it's speculation at the moment. And I would like to say that I'm for a short meeting. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think to an extent you're right. We're not going to be able to come to any financial conclusions, but there may still be commentary that that will come out that will inform and help some of our colleagues. I've got Michael and then Chris. Michael Clark.
Thanks, Chairman. Just sticking with the subject of the reserves and the liquidity position of the council, I am reassured by what Barry has said about there being no immediate risk of a 114 notice being required. And I do go back to the nightmare situation which we had in this council 2 years ago, when we seemed to be steering completely blind and unaware of the really serious nature of the council's liquidity, hence the need then for not one but two of these 114s. So I think we all bear to some extent the scars of that in our memories. I am reassured by that, but just two questions really. In the Cabinet report, which is now a historic document, the projected gap was between 14 and 27 million pounds. that was obviously an estimate, and we're all trying to pluck numbers out of thin air here. I'd like to ask whether that estimate remains as it was, i.e., there is still a projected gap between 14 and 27 million. Second question is really where we're going with all this. There are more questions than answers, obviously. We should meet again. It's a moving feast, as Malcolm said. But looking ahead to the end of the financial year and the all-important transition to unitary, when the budget was put together, the NCC budget, we were forecasting a projected reserve level of £40 million thereabouts to take forward to the West, to the unitary, to the two new unitaries to be split on some sort of basis. Would it be fair to say that when all the dust is settled on this, whether we are up or down on what the current estimates are, that the reserves will in effect take the strain of any shortfall, and therefore the real impact of all this will not be so much on balancing the budget this year, but the possible inadequacy of any brought forward balances to the new West Northants and North Northants unitary councils.
Comment?
Well, I think in terms of the gap, the revised gap is in the region of £18 million, and what we need to identify is, how much of that gap is accounted for in the current financial year, and how much of that gap will be in future years because of what I've said about the collection fund and the way that's accounted for. So what we're saying at the moment is that the gap has reduced to 18 million, in the main because we've shifted some of that market underwriting cost out from the initial return. So we've taken a sort of 50-50 view that actually a lot of that market underwriting cost can be met from within existing budgets. In terms of liquidity, obviously I'm monitoring the cash flow position on a regular basis. I get that weekly from our treasury management specialist, who does an excellent job. And what we're saying at the moment is that up until the end of August, we're projecting net positive cash flow of 50 million. But just the caveat on that is that we're expecting a lot of the social care costs to kick in August. So although we're cash positive until August, I will review that again when these care packages kick in on hospital discharges in particular. But just some assurance that at the moment we're substantially cash positive and will remain so at least until the autumn, and where it will be reviewed again. I think in terms of balances, the point I would make is that we actually overshot balances. If you look at the current report on 2019-20, we ended with over 40 million in reserves. So it was quite a positive message in 19-20, because actually we ended up with more in balances than we were projecting towards the end of 2021. I can't see a position where I would use those balances to fund COVID-19. And I would expect not just myself, but district colleagues as well, because it's the reserve position for two unitary councils is not just predicated on the county council's balances, it's also predicated on the aggregation of the district and borough reserves into the two unitaries as well. So there's risk on the county's balances, which I'm managing, but there's also risk on the other reserves within the other councils as well.
Okay, I've got Chris, and I'd like to come back and ask a question. Something you just said, but Chris?
Nick, can I add to that? Nick, can I add to that?
Yes, sorry, of course.
Yeah, thanks, Mick. Yeah, I mean, Mike, you've touched on the essence of this discussion today. I mean, there's a lot of water to go into this bridge yet, and we all know that. And not the least of which I come back to is, what's the government going to do? I mean, that may be something the government has said they're going to do this, going to do that. Well, let's see what happens in the final analysis, and then we're in a position. But the use of reserves, as Barry's just alluded to, would be way down the pecking order as far as I'm concerned. It would be one of the very last things I would want to go to. It would, so it's not even being discussed at the moment. So we've spent 2 years building up these reserves. We've got the reserves higher than we expected them to be at the end of this financial year. So we're ahead of the game. We fully expected to expand on that still further, and have 3 years. And so we're not going to give that up too easily, I can tell you. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Chris.
Thanks, Mick. So I think we're right to start with this issue around possible Section 114s or not, and the effect on the overall effect on the budget of what finance the county might receive from the government. And you know, that's the huge worry. What bothers me quite a bit about finances that might come from the government in the future to fill the gap is things like a tweet from Robert Jenrick, who's the minister concerned, MHCLG, the other day, who tweeted that the returns from councils indicate an expenditure of 1.25 billion from March to May against a grant of 3.2 billion from central government. And that always worries me when the government starts saying we've given you lots of money and you haven't spent even half of it yet, chaps. And I can see where that might be going. So I suppose if it turns out that there maybe is some more money from government, or there maybe isn't, and we do have a shortfall, I think the message I'm getting very clearly, both from Malcolm, definitely from Malcolm and probably from Barry too, is that the first place that the county council will be looking to fill that gap will be in reducing expenditure rather than using reserves. And that means cuts to services effectively. I just want to know that I've interpreted that correctly, and that is indeed where the burden will be felt, if you like. I've got some other questions, mate, but I'll come to them later if that's okay.
Yeah, of course. Barry, any comments on that?
Well, clearly the Local Government Association and other interested bodies are lobbying for more money from government, and government is pushing back in the public arena, as you would expect. I think the question about what's being spent about versus the potential gap is the old misunderstanding between the fact that the council is focusing on a balanced budget for the whole financial year, whereas the civil service tend to focus on cash because they don't really accrue budgets and get focused on cash basis. So that old trope is feeding that line. I think, but as you would expect, at the officer level, we're working very closely with county councils, network society, county treasurers, the Association of Local Authority Treasurers, senior officials within MHCLG, to just try and this is why we're working quite important to try and standardise returns as well, just to try and bring a sensible debate as to what the pressure actually is and how it could be accounted for correctly. Certainly, Councillor Sandberg, at this point in time, I'm not considering any cuts to service at this point in the process.
Okay, I mean, it does seem, doesn't it, as though we are hoping that government will come up with more money. And I'm minded that the Secretary of State has publicly said that there wouldn't necessarily be full funding from government for council services. But sorry, Chris, you wanted some more questions?
I'll be moving us on to a different subject. Is that okay? Right. Okay. So in amongst the various background papers that we requested, for which many thanks, they were very informative. There was a comment at the end of one of them regarding the financial impact in 2019-20 of the COVID-19 emergency, to the effect that the impact of £600,000 in 1920 has been absorbed within the 1920 outturn and no grant has been used to fund it, and that therefore 100% of the COVID-19 grant will be available in 2021. Yet in various paragraphs within the Cabinet report, it says something different, specifically paragraph 5.8, paragraph 4.62, paragraph 4.53, and paragraph 4.35. So I'm talking about the report to Cabinet, the monthly finance report, and 5.8 says quite clearly there's been no impact on the outturn position as the spending incurred in 1920 has been funded through the initial grant funding allocation from the government. Those two things can't possibly both be right. So can I ask which it is? Has the impact in 1920 been funded from the grant received from government, or has it been absorbed within the 1920 outturn?
Well, the cabinet report was the period 12 forecast, not the period 12 outturn. They will be doing an outturn report, and I'm not proposing that we fund any of the expenditure on COVID-19 in 1920 from the grant. I think it's right that we carry the grant forward into 2021 where the major impact will be felt. And I'll be putting that into the outturn report. Again, just to remind that the period 12 was a forecast, not the outturn.
Thanks for that, Barry. So the upshot of that is then that the underspend that was in the forecast report of £641,000 becomes an underspend of £41,000, or no, even lower than that, because it's 609 in the outturn report. So that's something worth bearing in mind. Can I ask a question on the briefing paper that we received on NAS from Anna? Thank you very much, Anna, for that. And regarding that, which was about the strengths-based working project with Newton Europe and the TOM savings. So the report that we received shows that the assumed £3.5 million from that project in saving in 2021 is now at risk, and so has been included in the relevant section there because of the transformation possibly being delayed. But the briefing from Anna still talks about us probably being able to deliver as much as £9 million worth of savings from this project. So again, which is it? Is it that we only think 3.5 million will be delivered and that's all at risk? Or is it, are we still confident that we're going to deliver around £9 million in 2021 from that project?
So the savings in that are still exactly the same. So the overall, which is what we presented to Scrutiny and to Cabinet, was that we would deliver 15 million savings, annualised savings, over an 18-month programme. Net of their fees would be a 9 million, but that was over an 18-month programme. We then profiled the 15 million over the years in which we thought it would be delivered. So 3.5 million in this year and the rest rolling into next year to get up to your annualised figure of 15. What we're saying is because the programme has had to be slimmed down in the beginning and will gradually ramp up, the in-year savings, we've got some at risk at the moment, which we will try to close the gap. But the 18-month position is still exactly the same. So we will achieve the same amount of savings over 18 months, but the profile will look different because of the resource implications of COVID.
So how much are we expecting in year 2021 from this project?
At the moment, and it all depends obviously on the profile and how much we can speed up the programme, because as the paper says, we've got a slim team and we've suspended, as you'd expect, some of the work streams like the acute work stream while COVID has been happening. We're expecting to resurrect that soon, but at the moment, based on the timing of the programme, assuming we can't speed that up, it's 1.5 million in year, and then we will, as I said, catch up the rest of it as we go into the end of the year into next year. If we're able to resurrect the rest of those programmes shortly, which we're hoping, the hospital one certainly we are hoping to resurrect very shortly, we may be able to bring that back and recover and get to the full 3.5 million. But at the moment, what we've put in is the worst case scenario, allowing for the COVID and possible impacts and delays on that.
Thanks very much.
Can I chip in a little bit with that on that same report? If the target operating model is going to save less money this year, and obviously it's the future years that make the big difference. I mean, we know that the company involved are only going to be paid on results. I must admit I hadn't realised, my own fault, I'm sure, until I'd read this report, that we're still paying them £6 million this year, even though that's obviously going to be a lot less than the savings we're expecting, and is based on the future savings. And if they don't make those future savings, they have to repay us. Is that correct? Am I reading that correctly? We are, even though they're paid by results, we are going to pay them in advance of that.
We're not paying them in advance of that, so we've reprofiled the payments to actual effort, if you like, and obviously we've got a slimmed down effort now, so monthly payments are less than they would have been if we had the full programme live at the moment, but we were always going to pay them as we went for the actual work done, and that again, it's not all in year, so it's an 18-month programme, so there are about 4 million of fees in year. Originally, if you remember, we were looking at savings of 3.5 million, and we expected to close that gap in year. So actually, in-year savings and in-year fees would have been similar, and then the savings would have exceeded all the fees as we went through to the full 18 months. With what's happened at the moment, obviously we have a risk of paying the fees, 4 million fees, and only getting 1.5 million of savings in year. But again, we're monitoring that. So if we actually manage to resurrect programs and pick up the profile again, then we will close that gap. But it was always the case that we pay them for actual effort. If at the end of the 18 months they cannot evidence, signed off by us very clearly about how the savings made, if we can't evidence 15 million of savings, then they would have to pay us back any fees until they got back to the ratio of being paid 1.5 times saving times their fee.
Okay, thank you. Graham, sorry, I've got a little hand next to your picture. Does that mean you want to speak? And then I've got Michael after that.
It does indeed, Chairman. It's there for everybody. Yeah, Barry has touched on this already, but I was interested in a comment in paragraph, I think it's 3.17 in the paper, that the cash flow for the first quarter would be positive by 32 million. And I wondered how much of this was government grants, how much of it was a normal situation the first quarter, and how much of it might be other factors such as expenditure that's not being incurred on something. It seems very strange that we should be so far positive in this situation.
It's a combination of factors. When I looked at the cash flow projections at the first turn on COVID-19, there was a danger that we were going to dip down below 20 million, which I thought was too low for a council this size, which is why I took out the £10 million PWLD loan. Now, subsequent to that, the government introduced a number of measures, which was twofold. One of which was immediate payment of the 1.6 billion money, and then we had essentially cash flow measures, which was payments of existing grants, Section 31 grant in particular. So rather than pay that over 12 instalments, they paid that upfront in one particular month. And then we had the second tranche of 1.6 billion, which we hadn't accounted for at all in the cash flow projections. So essentially, a combination of those factors has meant that at least up until the autumn, that cash flow wise, we're relatively well off.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Michael, you wanted to comment?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Just coming back to what Anna said about the moving position with regard to the savings projected by Newton. If I've understood you correctly, the target for the year was a £3 million saving. With the impact of COVID, we're looking at a saving reduced to possibly £1 to £1.5 million. That being the case, could you just clarify whether the projected savings to be brought about by the Newton initiative were factored in to the 220-221 budgets or not? If they were, then does that mean that the reduction or projected reduction in any benefit impacts on the budget? If they were not included, does that mean that these savings then would come as a sort of surplus to adult social care by the end of the financial year, whatever the surplus is?
So the in-year savings for this was 3.5 million. We're looking at the moment at a revised view of 1.5, as I said, subject to us to being able to close that gap if we can. In terms of the 15 million annualised savings, going back to what we said, so over the 18 months, a net 9 million, and thereafter 15 million a year, with a stretch, if you remember, of 25 million a year. That's been built into the forward forecast for the unitaries. So all the savings that any of the councils have, which have rolled into future years, are built into that profile and then being worked up as part of the shadow budgets when we're looking at the balance of those budgets. So whilst they may not have shown in the NCC side, they are being tracked and monitored as part of the future unitaries, because obviously by then it will be affecting the unitaries, not NCC.
Sorry, I muted that. Just to be clear on that, Anna, the impact of these changes on the 2021 NCC budget are, as you said, there would be a reduction then of possibly 1 to 1.5 million on any projected savings, yeah?
So it was 3.5. We're now saying it would be 1.5.
1.5,
yeah, exactly, yeah.
And will that have to be then considered as a variance to the budget?
Yes, in the first instance, we'd have to probably look for something like capital, flexible use of capital receipts or similar. However, as I said, one of the things we did as part of the robustness savings was be really clear where these savings came from and how we made them. So we're tracking everything very, very closely. As I said, if we're able to speed them up, then we will. So the final variance will depend on how the programme pans out through this year. But yes, it would show as a variance and a pressure, which is one of the pressures reported back into the COVID cost, if you like, in terms of slippage.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Anna. Thank you, Michael. If I could maybe take us back a little bit, talking about the COVID costs, the COVID pressures. Barry, you spoke about a couple of things. Firstly, the 600,000 from 1920, which was sort of extra cost from COVID, but we used basically the existing budget, so it wasn't touching the emergency grant. And also the ongoing costs for this year about what's it called, market underwriting. In the cabinet report, we were originally suggesting that might be 13 million, but you said a few moments ago that you were shifting some of that and hoping to use existing budgets to reduce that 13 million figure. Now, both of those two things are clearly linked to the COVID emergency. So I'm just wondering how that will those figures still show up in the total amount that COVID had cost us that we'll be talking to government about, because it seems that we are relying more and more for government to come back with hopefully some extra money. And I'd hate to think that because some of it has been sort of done last year, some of it is done by existing budgets, it's not being counted towards COVID, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. That does make sense, and certainly we will be using that 600,000 as part of our total COVID aggregate cost that's reported to government. I think the grant that we got, although it was paid in March, it was always intended for the 2021 financial year. It was going to be paid in April, but they paid it a month early. So the market underwriting is probably the most uncertain part of the COVID pressure, because, as I said before, it's not clear that the government wants to treat this as a recoverable cash advance or just a grant in many respects. And also, what happens when we do a final reconciliation about what the auditors have called double bubble in terms of organisations that have received ongoing funding from the council in terms of market underwriting, but also potentially furlough costs from the government and business support costs from district councils for the money that they've had, how all that pans out in the wash, because clearly if they've had the same income from three sources, the government's intention is that that's recovered back. That's an important point, because if we think about, for example, some of the market underwriting that we're doing for care homes, we've got an existing care home placements budget that can come out of, and essentially what we're doing is paying for non-delivery of service from those existing budgets, and it's the same with the money that we give to the bus companies as well. We have an existing budget for travel, and those payments will come out of that budget. I think the impact will be to recover that money from some of these companies, because the view is that they've had additional grant funding from elsewhere that should have covered up some of that cost. But that's very, very difficult difficult to put a number on at this point in time. And until the government, via the Cabinet Office, give us some guidance on how we treat them, then what I'm saying at the moment that it's coming out of existing budgets. And if we have to do a recovery, then there'll probably be a bad debt issue associated with that as well. But that, again, until we get the government guidance, it's a very complicated picture. And I've taken that particular pressure out of the May cost impact.
Okay, so I mean, this all adds to the confusion generally about how much we'll end up spending, and in particular about how government will view some of this expenditure, which may or may not be related to any further money from them. Committee, any other questions or comments? I do appreciate that we are talking, as Cecile pointed out earlier, about things we don't fully understand yet. Jonathan. Councillor Eakins. You need to unmute, John.
Got it now. Sorry. Yes, I mean, I think what's we have to make sure here, I know that we're talking about the cost of COVID spending and how it is going to increase and how it is going to impact on NCC's budget for this year. And it will certainly impact on the budget that we set for next year and going over into unitaries. But what we must not take our eyes off the fact is that the whole idea of COVID-19 is unprecedented in our lifetimes, and with the people that are suffering and passing away from it all. The thing that must be on the top of the list is to make sure that our community in Northamptonshire is safe. And unfortunately, we cannot put a cost on safe. We cannot put a cost on people's health and well-being, including their lives. So we are, as Barry and Malcolm has said, it's unprecedented. We do not know what the cost of this is going to be. And we do not know what the final cost is going to be. It's certainly going to be higher than the figures that we're talking about and mentioning now. But at the same time, we must be aware of not only the our own departments in the adults and children's services as well. This is going to give us additional pressure on, but in the wider community and the charitable and care homes and the community care centres that people are setting up. We can't leave them in the middle of nowhere with no funding. We have to do that. These people are the volunteer and the backbone of helping us cope with the outcome and the outfall of COVID-19. These people are making sure that our elderly and vulnerable people are kept safe, well, they're kept them fed, they're going doing, shopping runs for them, food banks and food deliveries, even down to pharmacy runs, etc. So it's a difficult thing to do, and I do not envy Malcolm or Barry at all in how they're going to try and balance the books on this one. But we certainly won't be able to do it without the support and help of the government and any funding from the government. So I have all faith in that our finance team will be looking at that, but we cannot be looking at it as a ledger to say what we cannot do because we've got the funding not available, or we're going to be short, or we're going to go and spend too much money. You cannot put a price on people's health, safety and lives. And I think that I'm pretty certain I can speak for most of us in saying that, but that's what we must be aware, and that the public, and ultimately I know that they're our taxpayers, they're the people who pay the council tax that will provide this service, and I don't think many people out there will begrudge it being done that way either. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And absolutely, I'm sure you do speak for all of us. And actually, that's probably my biggest concern when talking about any potential shortfall, when talking about government perhaps not covering all that we need to do. If we can't fund this properly, we could end up with a situation where we have to cut corners, and that would be totally unacceptable. You're absolutely right. There needs to be a full public response to COVID, and that will come at a cost. Any other questions, comments? Chris, and then Jane.
I've just got a brief one, Chair, and it's about understanding more than anything else. So the paper that Barry did for us, which has various breakdowns of service pressures and the like, each item has a RAG rating, and I was hoping to try and understand what that RAG rating is indicating, please.
Barry?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. The RAG rating is about our confidence in the estimate. So if it's green, we're fully confident that that is a robust estimate. If it's amber, then it might vary a bit. If it's red, then it's subject to significant variation because it might be out in the future or it's dependent upon many other factors. And as you would expect in month one, what we couldn't do was a 100% guaranteed, absolutely certain estimate of what the cost of COVID-19 might be. So it's our assessment of the robustness of the estimate at this point in time.
Okay, Chris. Yep.
Yeah, good.
Jane.
Thanks.
Sorry. Yeah, Jane.
Thank you, Mick. I'm very pleased that Jonathan's brought up the wider issues of the effects of COVID as we move into the next 12, 18 months, 2 years, however long it's going to take. One of the huge effects is going to be on young people. Their education has been disrupted. They are out of the habit of going to school, thinking about teenagers who've had the freedom to do what as they choose and to use the days and the hours as they feel inclined, whether it's work or not. Many of them will have had so much interruption to their education that they will not achieve the potential that they could. Their life chances will be affected. And going back to RAG rating that Barry's just referred to, the need to contact offer, I see as red and a risk to project. This sort of follow-up, this support for school leavers who may not achieve the grades and the qualifications that they would have done had they been in school in the time that they've missed, is going to be absolutely essential for them to have that offer, to have it really robustly targeted at the problems they're facing. So I would like some reassurance that the long-term effects are being considered, and particularly the young people that are our future. They're the people that are going to be working and living in our communities in the future. Thank you.
No, I'm not talking.
Thank you.
Can I just clarify something, Chair?
Barry.
Yeah, I think it's important to point out that actually that red is about the estimate of the risk of delivery of saving. The service still continues and the service will still be doing what it does and doing what it does very well. But actually the red is not about the service, it's about the assessment of the risk of the saving in that particular year.
Oh, Chris Haynes is lying in bed in her bed, and this is all going out on YouTube. Oh, God, I'd never do it.
It's a mute, Sandra.
I don't know who was talking. Right, any further questions, comments from the committee? Then I guess we need to try and wrap up this particular agenda. No? Okay. It's going to be difficult for us to offer any, I think, conclusions at this stage. I mean, clearly, as Barry and Malcolm and others have said, it is a movable piece. This, nobody knows how we're going to end up. But are there any particular points we want to raise to our leadership, to the cabinet, about how perhaps this is monitored going forward? I mean, the one thing I would perhaps want to say is that clearly we need more government funding, because clearly whatever the figures end up being, there is a shortfall for this financial year, and this council, perhaps more than any council, are going to have difficulties to make up that shortfall. But at the same time, I'd also like to stress, I think, to the leadership, if we don't get that extra funding, it could pose a real risk for us moving forward. Any comments though?
Sorry, Kurt, can I just step in on that one? Because I think it's important to point out that we're probably not the worst affected by this. There are other councils who are much worse off than us in this situation. So whilst our financial position is fragile, we're certainly not the worst affected by the COVID-19 pandemic.
Okay, appreciate your comments, and I obviously wouldn't know whether we're the worst affected, but we do need to consider our local position, and I think I think we'd be remiss if we didn't even sort of raise this potential risk. But Michael, you wanted to make a comment?
Really just wanted to follow up what Barry just said, because we have these huge figures which are appearing in reports. They are guesstimates, and they're going to obviously impact on the way things happen in the next 6 to 9 months moving forward to unitary. I just wanted to ask Barry whether in his conversations with colleagues on the LGA, the figures that we are dealing with in Northamptonshire as an upper tier authority, are they broadly in line with peer group? Are we out of sync with peer group, up or down? That's to say, as is probably going to be the case, the government will bring a sum of money and talk about billions of pounds in weeks and months to come. That will have to be split up then between the various spending authorities. And there will then be some sort of dispute as to whether it's enough, and of course it won't be enough. But as things stand at the moment, do you think that the position of the county council is one which finds us broadly in the middle of this range? Are we below or above it? Any feel on that at the moment?
Certainly from the first return that we did when the Society of County Treasurers technical team did their analysis, we were broadly in line with most county councils, allowing for population differences and whatever else. I think what Society of County Treasurers have done, which is a wise move, is to get us all to come together, facilitated by Grant Thornton, to use a standardised methodology for filling the second return in, because clearly when we looked at the first return, there were some big variances. Again, we were in almost in the middle, but if you looked at both the inner and outer edges of that, there were some large variances. So when you see the May return, you'll see some councils have gone up, some councils have gone down, as we've sort of met in the middle due to the methodology. Now, one of the things that we need to, it's not so much a local issue, but it's a national issue, is that when the COVID crisis hit and the government announced their initial funding, the clear message from government at the time was spend whatever you like and we'll pick up the bill at the end. So some councils may have taken a very, very different approach to how they spent that money and how they pooled that money with the NHS to what we did, which was reach a local agreement on the ground with the CCG and the NHS as to how the care packages would be cut. So even though we're using a standard methodology, the way that some councils have approached this is very, very different. Personally, I think we've done the right thing. We've got a local agreement in place. We'll not be picking any care costs up until August, and we'll be doing that on a managed basis, where I think some councils rush to spend that money on the back of a government guarantee to fund any gap. So just to say that it's sometimes hard to compare because we've made different decisions locally.
Okay, thank you. I should say I've got a couple of councillors whose video feed has disappeared. So if you are there waving at me, I'm not going to be able to see you. So you'll just have to unmute and dive in if you've got any comments to say. Any other comments? Chris.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, so I do agree that cash flow / liquidity is something that we need to pay attention to. I understand what Barry says. We're not in a position that some other councils might find ourselves in, and that things are as good as they probably can be at the moment, and that we don't have a problem right now. But I think as a scrutiny function, it's something we need to pay attention to at the moment. Now, that might not be like in the next month, but it could be in the next 4 or 5 months, and we need to keep a watching brief on that one. So that's one thing. We also need, and it's an allied thing, progress with negotiations with the government on further funding is going to be fundamental, and any government announcements and what the implications are for the county council, because if it becomes clear that there is going to be a shortfall, that's when the problems will start to arise, and measures will have to be taken. It would be useful to have a revised breakdown of the figure for market underwriting, which was in the report that was written for Cabinet, to see how that's changed. So if that were possible, that would help. And finally, for me at least, and if I'm out of step with everybody else, then I'm quite happy to pursue this independently. I still want to fully understand the savings that are going to be made from the strength-based working Newton project, Tom project in NAS, when they are going to be made. Because if, for instance, we're told it's an 18-month project, and it's likely that perhaps the savings in this year will now be as little as £1.5 million in this current financial year. That implies that the rest of the 15 million gross will be delivered in the 3 or 4 months of the project that will remain in the next financial year. And if that's the case, that's fine. But I think it's something that we need to monitor and be reassured about, because slippage in that one, which is the major saving in the budget, would not be a good thing.
Okay, thank you. And on the question of extra monitoring, we've heard today, haven't we, that actually the expenditure expected with COVID has gone down for whatever reason. And I think, didn't Barry, you said, I think there was a gap now projected, admittedly, of 18 million, which is potentially an improvement, because we were at one stage looking at up to 27 million. I think it will be important for all members, not just this committee, and certainly Cabinet members, to be kept abreast of this moving piece, how it's changing. I assume there's going to be another report to Cabinet about COVID finance. I certainly hope there is, because I think it's important that they're aware of how this is changing. And I certainly think that we will need to come back, and it will be useful in the meantime for us to perhaps be given updates as and when that they are available. Unless there's any other questions or comments, James, can I ask you, do you have a feel of the discussion, a feel of the meeting, so we can maybe, the sort of thing that perhaps will go into our minutes that we can share with Cabinet members so they're aware of some of the things that we've been discussing?
I think so, Chair, yes. So the key comments, if I use that term, arising from the discussion seem to be around reinforcing the points about the need for the government to consider the impact on local authorities of responding to COVID-19 and the potential risks that of there being a gap between the funding available and to local authorities and the funding needed. I'm sure that would be a case of Scrutiny reinforcing something that the Cabinet are no doubt very aware of and are working towards anyway. But the support from Overview and Scrutiny may well be welcome in doing that. Then I think there's been a lot pointing towards this being the subject of a further discussion by the Overview and Scrutiny Committee. Clearly, you've got the next meeting of this committee will be in July, so there would be an opportunity then, if members so desired, to revisit this, and that could pick up the various aspects that have been raised by individual members, so around the importance of keeping abreast of the change position, but also the particular aspects around cash flow and liquidity, around the outcomes of any ongoing discussions with the government around national funding, and how the position may change in terms of the revised the demands on the council relating to market underwriting, for example, and potentially even the change, the developing position around the profiling of savings from the Europe work could be picked up in that too. So that's what I took from the discussion, Chair. I'm happy to stand as corrected as need be by members.
Okay, thank you. I think that was probably a good précis. I do want to bring in, if I may, on those points, the leader of the council, Councillor Matt Goldby. I think you indicated you'd like to make a brief comment. Matt.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Apologies, I should have indicated a second ago. I just took a phone call. But just to thank Scrutiny for the meeting and for the comments. I look forward to receiving a note. I think it's been a good discussion, and it's a discussion that is very much live between myself, Cabinet, and the likes of Barry and the senior leadership team. But in terms of government funding, I think one of the points that needs to be made is that we shouldn't really make a case to say that we're any more special than anyone else, because that's what so the last administration fell foul of, I think. And I think we need to make sure we're acting as we are with the likes of the County Councils Network, the Local Government Association. We've got good links through the commissioners direct into the department. And I think, as Barry has, I think, quite well articulated, we're in a reasonable position. If I listen to calls up and down the country that I take part on, we're in the middle sort of ballpark of the level of pressures, and we're not as bad off as some. We're still in a relatively precarious place given the history and all the points that we've discussed around reserves and things. But we're in a reasonable place to take on this challenge, and hopefully we can monitor it, as you've discussed today, bring more reports back to Cabinet and through Scrutiny, and hopefully demonstrate that we are able to deal with this as we have dealt with the pressures and the situation over the last couple of years. So I look forward to receiving the notes from Scrutiny and the summary of the meeting. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Matt. And I think you're right. And I think we're all optimistic and hopeful that government will step up and see and recognise not only this council's position, but other councils. Having said that, of course, there, if that were not to happen, we do need to be aware of the councils need to react quickly. Okay, any last comments on this before we close this agenda item and move forward? In that case, I'd like to thank, in particular, Malcolm, Matt, and Barry Scarr for their, and Anna, who I know has had to leave because she had another meeting. But thank you very much for officer input into that discussion. It was really useful, and I think, along with the information you'd already sent us, all of us now have a better understanding, as good as that can be in the circumstances. Thank you very much. Okay, the next item on today's agenda, and you'll have to bear with me, my desk isn't quite as big as it is if I was at County Hall, will be the work programme, agenda item 7. James Edmonds.
Thank you, Chair. So this is in large part the standard agenda item, which enables the committee to take an overview of its forward work programme, to consider items it had previously identified for scrutiny, whether they still remain a priority, whether anything new should be added, whether priorities should be changed, to ensure that the committee is always focused on the most productive areas for scrutiny that reflect the remit given to it by the council. The report also includes the standard updates on responses to previous resolutions from the committee. Having said that this is the standard item, there is a particular focus on the work programme at this point, given the committee was alerted at its last meeting to the fact that there was the work programme as it stood was quite open. That followed the completion of a number of substantial previous pieces of work. The same still applies, so the committee is invited to give attention to those items that it wishes to choose to scrutinise during the year ahead. Clearly, when considering that, though, the committee needs to take due regard of the context in which it is operating, and section 4 of the report discusses the factors involved there. So not only as we were expecting the fact that we're going into the year when the shadow authorities will be operating, and that's had a bearing on the number of committee meetings in the year ahead. Also has a bearing on the committee's work as well, given that, for example, it won't need to scrutinise the development of a new council budget. Obviously, as well, on top of that, when considering the work it may do in the year ahead, the committee needs to take account of the situation around COVID-19, both the impact that's having on the council and the practical impact that's having on the way that the committee works. So Section 5 of the report goes on to identify, or set out rather, a couple of potential areas for focus that the committee had previously highlighted. And then just touching on the responses to previous resolutions at Appendix 1, there is nothing significant that hasn't been addressed, although there are a number of actions from the previous meeting that have effectively been superseded by, again, the coronavirus situation that has developed in the meantime. So as I say, Chair, fundamentally, this item is to give the committee an opportunity to consider potential work, how that is for the year ahead, how that prioritise the approach that it should be used to do that, but obviously in the context that the committee is currently working in. So I'm happy to take any questions, Chair. Otherwise, it's over to members.
Thank you, James. Given the discussion we've just had, where the phrase moving feast was used several times, and certainly regarding the COVID issues, it is literally changing daily and weekly. Our next meeting is the 29th of July, and we have scheduled a pre-meeting on the 1st of July. I would recommend that we actually do not at this stage choose a topic for that end of July meeting, because who knows where we will be by the 1st of July. Things could have changed dramatically. Clearly, we need to be looking at the in-year budget position. Clearly, we need to be looking at COVID, but I would suspect we could finalise exactly how that will work at that pre-meeting on the 1st of July. That's just my thought. I'll throw it open. I do want to come back and talk about health scrutiny, but I do have Cecile and then Jill who've indicated they wish to speak. Cecile, your video feed has gone. I don't know if we can hear you.
Yes, just a second. I was running out of juice, but I changed position so I can stay on. Sorry. You are taking, because I was things, and you were taking, if it's a long Zoom program, you need to be plugged out, and I was on my laptop, my fault.
No problem.
Thank you.
Oh, I see, that was your point. Okay, sorry. Jill.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I did actually have my hand up on the minutes, because although we certainly just said, you know, are they correct records? I wanted to come back on a couple of points. They're basically to do
can I absolutely apologise? That's one of the difficulties in seeing these tiny little logos of you all. I do apologise, but yeah, please do.
No problem. But you know, I think it can come in with the work programme quite easily. It's on the Children's Trust, and obviously I know there have been updates and changes to that. There were a couple of items that were mentioned as to be put in a letter to the Cabinet member, and that was particularly the one around education and how that will pan out with the Children's Trust, and also providing shadow counsellors with appropriate information and training to support them when taking any decisions that may be relevant to the functioning of the Children's Trust. Although we're obviously going to need to focus heavily on COVID and how that's impacting it, I think that we need to certainly get an update on the Children's Trust at that July meeting, and you know, whether it's a substantive item or just an update. I think I don't know where we'll be with it at that stage, but we may know certainly a bit more than we do at the moment. So I think we ought to consider putting that on an agenda.
Okay, just to confirm that we did, on behalf of Overview and Scrutiny, write to the children's portfolio holder. She indeed, I presume that letter was circulated. I don't remember, it's a while back now. She said, oh, it wasn't, perhaps it should have been, but certainly responded that she was listening to our views. I think you're absolutely right. It would be good, wouldn't it, to get an update on where we are with the Children's Trust, because clearly the July date is way out of the window now, and I don't know exactly what the current expectations are. Might it be worth us having asking for a written briefing that could be circulated before our pre-meeting on the 1st of July, and once we've received any update, we can then discuss on the 1st of July whether it's something we need to pursue more formally forward.
That would be a good idea, Chairman. Then we can see whether, if there are no updates because things haven't moved on sufficiently, then we'll know to leave it for a later date.
Okay, we'll do that. But Michael, sorry, you wanted to chip in?
Yes, looking at the whole series of services we're delivering, the one service which clearly stands out as the Achilles heel of the council, apart from obviously the ongoing financial situation, as the children's services. And there seems to me to be so much, I say, lack of clarity and uncertainty at the moment surrounding this, that we need a scrutiny to get a report as to where we are with, well, from the head of service, Kath Hadley, as to where we are with recovering from the critical Ofsted report of last year. That is all important in my view, that the overall performance of our children's services is seen to be on the up, certainly not a repetition of what we had last time. And as Councillor Mercer said, the delay in the setting up of the Children's Trust with all the COVID issues is factored into all this, but it really doesn't help us much. We've lost a chief executive, or the interim chief executive. We're losing him, I understand, at the end of July. I think it'd be helpful if we were to invite, I think the gentleman's name is Mr. Scurry, who is the new chairman who's been appointed of the trust. I don't know whether anybody's met him or not, but I think it would be very useful for us to get his input in July, after another 2 or 3 months, of how he sees the trust emerging, what work has been done already, taking stock of that, where we are going forward, and the way the whole thing is going to pan out. Because there are, as with so many things, there's a lot of uncertainty surrounding this service, and it's something where we could easily take our eye off the ball, and we just can't afford to do that.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Whether or not we could also ask for a sort of, I think it would be useful to ask for a brief written briefing about where children's improvements are currently heading. And yes, it may be that we, depending on what the response to that is, we still want to look at this more formally. I've got Cecile, then Jane, and then we'll come back to that point and make a decision. Cecile, are you with us? Possibly not. Jane.
Thank you, Chair. I think the Children's Trust is an absolutely vital area for us to look at. There's been so much instability in the children's services and in the appointment of the senior leadership. Another area that isn't really looked at as closely is the links with education. Are we going to have two separate education authorities in the West and the North? Is the Children's Trust going to overarch? What are the links going to be between them? Because I'm very conscious of the problems that schools are going to face as they start to open up, and the disruption to the education, and the consequent need for the social service, children's social services, to be supporting in schools, because the links between the children's mental health and the the real sort of anxieties and fears that a lot of children are feeling at the moment with the strange situation they find themselves in is going to be, we're going to need to draw on children's services as well as looking at the supporting the education. So the way that those two elements of our children's services are going to work together in the future, I think is problematic, and I'd like to have some clarity on how people see this as it develops and moves forward. Thank you.
Thank you, indeed, and this is something that was discussed a little bit, wasn't it, at the last meeting, the confusion around how this will work. And to be fair, I think even the Children's Commissioner himself was saying there needs to be more clarification of how that will work in the future. So yeah, certainly we need to revisit that. I think what I'm suggesting is we can, at our pre-meeting, work out the detail of who we get before us, the sort of questions we're going to ask. But in the meanwhile, it would be good just to get an update anyway on what's happening, because our next meeting isn't until July, which is a long way away. So I'm suggesting, I think, that we ask for a written update on where the Children's Trust is. Some of the points that Michael and yourself, Jane, have raised about both improvements in children's services and how it fits in with education, or how it's deemed to be fits in with education, and then we'll discuss that in detail on the first and decide where we need to move forward. Does that make sense? Okay, James, I think we've got agreement there, so we'll go ahead and do that. And I say that also we stay flexible enough, so on the first, if we need to, we can go in other directions depending on what's happening in the Northamptonshire world at that time. The thing I wanted to discuss then briefly was health scrutiny. This has been highlighted. You'll have seen we've had a bit of an email chat about this, because the various health bodies preparing their qualified accounts at this time of year, and as the Scrutiny Committee of the County Council, we've been asked to comment on them. Now, you'll remember when this committee was first set up, we were given very much a remit to focus on the council's finances, and we haven't therefore really had the opportunity or the flexibility to delve into scrutinising the local health service in the way that probably we should be in some ways, certainly the way that I'm sure we'd like to. As a result of that, regarding the quality accounts, and I think there's only been one received so far by the council, which should have been circulated to everybody. I met with the chairs, or virtually met with the chairs and vice chairs, and we decided that it might be better at this stage to not make a formal comment unless anybody had some particular things they wanted to raise, but just point out that our restrictions haven't really allowed us to be involved in the health service in the way that the system is supposed to allow. And consequently, discussions with Victoria and Chris as vice chairs, what we would like to do, and I'd like to raise this with you guys now, is go back to the commissioners and get their steer on how NCC should do this, because we're clearly restricted under the remit we have, and we don't believe that health scrutiny is actually taking place in an efficient way. We have the legal statutory duty to do it, but we've got one hand tied behind our back. Now, if the commissioners accept that we should be doing this, we need to have a discussion about the capability and the resources to do so, or whether NCC could do this in another way, possibly set up a specific health scrutiny. I think actually would be a good idea, so people are focused with that sort of expertise. So that's my suggestion. We have a discussion with the commissioners in the next week or two to get a steer on where they think they will be, and get some sort of answer from them as to what we should be doing. Jill, you've been waiting patiently to come in while I was waffling. Thank you.
I sent an email back, which I copied everyone in on this topic, just to remind you that we did actually have a sort of health scrutiny working party. I know certainly Councillor Smith-Haynes and myself were on that, and we did look at each of the sets of accounts. Sometimes they were a bit in draft form, so it was somewhat difficult to look at them in detail, but we did send comments back on each of them. Now, I know the health has sort of been pushed to one side a bit, and the fact that we're focused on budget, but we did have also this health remit, and so we did do that, although I think we could have done an awful lot more, but at least we did do that. And I think it's certainly worth, as I said in my email, talking to commissioners about it to see which way forward we take. But I think it would be, certainly in this time when health is so important, has taken a front stand at the moment, that we do review those sets of audited accounts. If it's a small subgroup or whatever, I think that would be a good idea.
We did. That was sort of 12 months ago when we were looking at one of my problems, one of my concerns is that since then, this committee has done absolutely nothing in health, and any view that we now take isn't therefore informed or coloured by any contacts we as a committee have had. It may be certain members having individual expertise to bring to this, and that's why I would sooner just accept the fact that we're not necessarily currently the best qualified to do it, and take the issue back to the commissioners and explain it in no uncertain terms to them, and we need to find a way forward. When we first set this committee up, I do remember we were given some advice about health scrutiny, saying, oh well, probably we won't need to do any scrutiny unless there are some big proposed changes in the local health service. But then in the second breath told, I think it was Adam Brooks at Oxford, where they'd had some issues with heart problems. One of the first questions they were asked was, what does the local authority scrutiny committee say? I think if we're going to do it, it needs to be done properly, and I'm not sure at the moment we have the facilities to do that.
So just to come back, another point was that I was invited to the Health Watch and took that on as a sort of sub thing, and I went along to one of their meetings, and I was going to go to the AGM, but I was conflicted. I had another meeting at the time, but since then I haven't been invited to any, so I got invited just one, and obviously that would be quite a good sort of link in it, whether James could perhaps ask them, you know, we haven't been invited to, or even if it's just one of us invited to those meetings, it's quite a good link to find out what's going on in the health services. It
is, and I'm not sure, were you invited as one of our committee members then?
Absolutely. Yeah. Oh, yes.
Yeah. And that's the point. There needs to be people able to give the time to do this properly, and that's why I want to have that discussion with the commissioners, if that's what you agree. Graham.
Thank you, Chairman. As you're probably all aware, I'm a governor at one of our two acute hospitals, and I would endorse this entirely, because there are significant moves going on, including a group management scheme to unite the two hospitals under one banner, though they're not merge them. And obviously there have been significant changes for Lucy Whiteman, Director of Public Health, in some of her role. The health services, obviously, and there's been a combination of the CCG. So there have been a number of significant deserve our time. And I think, given that we're not going to be doing a budget this year, perhaps we have an argument to say we have some possibility of using some time to look at this as we're supposed to.
Okay. Well, what I propose is, James, if you could fix a meeting up with chairs and vice chairs in the next week or two with the commissioners, conference call, whatever, we could report back to the pre-meeting and depending on what happens there, have a further discussion about what either this committee should do or what NCC as a whole needs to do. Sorry, Cecile. You're back. We did try and call you in earlier, actually. You're still unmuted. Muted, rather.
So that's it.
Chair,
Now I
if I
can
could.
unmute. Yes, to come back to what Jill said, we are always welcome to go to a Health Watch meeting and to participate. You don't need to be invited. It's a public meeting and they send to all councillor invitation. So if we want to go to Health Watch and contribute, we will be more than welcome. Thank you.
Absolutely, and that's true, obviously, of any member of the council. But the question is about the statutory role that NCC has, and whether that falls on this committee. And if it does, we don't really have the formal resources, so we need to. We'll have a discussion, and we'll take a view depending on what comes out of that. Okay, in that case, unless there's anything else, if everybody's agreed with that. Yep. Unless there's anything else, that brings us to the end of this formal meeting. We will hopefully, before we meet again, be getting a couple of updates, in particular around children's services, the Children's Trust and education, and how those three sort of all work together. And our pre-meeting, which will, I'm assuming at this stage, be a virtual meeting on the 1st of July, we will input that and decide what we're going to do on the 29th of July, which is our formal meeting. I'd just like to thank everybody for attending today. Apologies for some of the technical stuff. It's a new way of working, but at least apart from James, I don't think we now have to drive home. So thank you very much for attending.
Thank you. Bye.